So I guess the first question is why oral history at all? I think it was your idea, Stephen.
Yeah, it came from Sarah and I sitting on the steps outside Pathfoot in this building. Just not long after COVID lockdowns ended, we were amongst the first folk back in the office, and realising how weird it felt and strange to be here at that time, and wanting to capture that perspective of other staff and students, and trying to get that essence on the record so soon after it happened.
Yeah, I think for me, I'd worked with oral history before, and I know how important it is to capture stories and memories while they're still fresh, and that kind of experience is kind of ingrained in us at that time, and within a year it's kind of drifted away and we don't quite remember what's happened. So yeah, it was really great to sort of start that process and to share stories and hear from other people.
Yeah, and using sort of literature and diaries as well. We collected diaries in the archive as a sort of separate collecting strand to the oral history project, but it's all about the way that people feel about it, and sometimes it's easier to have a sort of literary touchstone or a bit of music or a film or something like that to sort of share emotions about the period. Like you say, some of the interviews were very, very emotional. I know Matt Cook, when he's talking about, particularly about the AIDS crisis in the 1980s in the UK, refers to this archive of feeling, archive of emotion, and discusses a lot why emotion is such an interesting and really important part of researching history, and it's not very often sort of there in the source material. So the fact that we've managed to capture a lot of that in diaries, even in sort of photographs to a certain extent, but particularly people's actual spoken word, I think is incredible.
And you know, that's kind of why we took this creative history approach, because mentioning and referencing these literary sources lets you kind of not draw out sort of factual information from the pandemic, but instead lets you sort of, I guess, engage with it at an emotional level, try and capture the essence of the moment in time, which is, I guess, what historians try and do anyway, but to do it in different ways and using a form of words or images that speak to that particular moment in time. So oral history combined with creative history and creative sources seem to make sense.
So I first became aware of the virus. It was on New Year's Eve 2019. I remember reading a newspaper article buried on something like page 18. And then obviously it was entirely to do with, bats, kind of, in Wuhan. And you could kind of chart in the 6 weeks after that, as they sort of moved from overseas news, which gets buried, and then breaks out on the front page.
I remember being at a meeting in late February, which was down in the north of England, and there were people from China and Italy at the meeting, and I remember thinking, oh, is this wise? Because it was just taking off in China and Italy at the time. By the time I got home from that meeting, I think there were reports of cases now appearing in England.
I think one of the really interesting things for me was that during the course of the interviews, people would mention music and also works of literature that really resonated with them and their experience. I think that interview process made us kind of think how different sources could be integrated into the project.
Yeah, and the best example of that was one interviewee who mentioned The War of the Worlds, of course the 1898 book by H.G. Wells, which is a book I always loved, and so that reference to it in the interview really sort of got my interest and made me realise you can use it to try and communicate the essence of the pandemic, because the book is all about the attack of an unknown force and having catastrophic effect on society, and also of a growing sense of panic as the Martians invade Earth, invade Victorian England. And that sense of panic came out in some of the interviews, in some of the news stories from the time. You can really see that, and we've used that, I think, in our article to show that sense of panic. And so using this sort of War of the Worlds as a kind of touchstone, as a sort of reference point, helps you communicate that essence. The book is important for that. It's also a story, a book that has been retold and used in different ways. Of course, famously in the 1930s, Orson Welles did a radio broadcast of it in the US, and a number of people thought the Martians were going to invade. More recently, a piece of music that I like very much, Jeff Wayne's musical version of The War of the Worlds from the 1970s, is another great example of it. But it's a story that speaks to different things depending on when it's been read. At the time, it was partly read as being about the danger to Britain from France and Germany, the danger of Britain's isolation. In the 20s, it was kind of seen as a book sort of preempting mechanised warfare. But we can read it, as we've read it on this occasion, about this attack from an unknown force against which society has no means of fighting until we had a vaccine.
So you understand the roaring wave of fear that swept through the greatest city in the world just as Monday was dawning. The stream of flight rising swiftly to a torrent, lashing in a foaming tumult round the railway stations, banked up into a horrible struggle about the shipping in the Thames, and hurrying by every available channel northward and eastward. By 10 o'clock, the police organisation, and by midday even the railway organisations, were losing coherency, losing shape and efficiency, guttering, softening, running at last in that swift liquefaction of the body politic.
I worked with Tesco's throughout my entire university career, and so there was a lot of discussion about a national lockdown coming in, and we'd already experienced the panic buying, and the fear was that this would send another wave of panic buyers, and that would be quite scary. And obviously we'd seen all the different measures come into place, and we were getting shouted at almost daily by customers, people saying, "Oh, you're not doing enough," or "Oh, you're being ridiculous, this is too much." And we were all just a bit worried that the lockdown would bring more of that.
The only thing I knew about it, and it was probably late February and into the start of March, where our director for estates and campus services started thinking that, do you know what, at some point I think the university is going to have to close. And they were saying to me, which doors do we need to lock to actually shut? So I spent maybe about a week at the start of March going round all the external doors in here and trying to find out which ones actually had locks in them, if any, because some of them just had a space where the lock should have been because they'd never been locked up, and others that had seized up. And then the other issue was we had keys for the doors, but because, well, I started here in 2008, we'd never locked any doors, so nobody knew where the keys were. So the preparations that we were looking at was how can we lock the university down, because most of our staff and most of our students, it's going to eventually be that we're going to have to work for home, and the university is going to be, like, to all intents and purposes, empty, like a ghost town.
So this is an email that I wrote just as we were leaving Pathfoot Building in March 2020, and I said, well, there we are. This is going to be an unusual period of unspecified length, so I wanted to take this opportunity to encourage us to look after each other a bit, even though at a distance. We're all thankfully very used to working at home in isolation, and indeed most of us enjoy it too. But usually we know we have the base in Pathfoot with a bit of company and support when we need it, and usually we also know when we're heading back into the maelstrom after a period out of it. This is not normal. Please can I ask you to check in with each other every so often, trying not to leave anyone out. And what I meant by that really was, I knew that we have a really good community around the division of history, heritage and politics, and I was pretty confident that people would continue to act as a community. But I was also very aware of some new folk that we had in the division, and I was really keen that nobody got left out because we didn't know how long we were going to be out of the building.
I mean, we did call out for diaries in the archive. We asked staff and students if they wanted to write a diary, not necessarily to donate to the archive, but the option was very much there. We wanted it more than anything to be a sort of well-being project. And there's such wonderful records, and some of them sort of stuck in photographs and tickets and posters. And Stephen, you were the first researcher to come in and use this resource in the archive, which is really cool.
I'm going to quote just now from one particular student's diary who wrote this in October 2020 at Halloween time, and I think it, as we'll see when I say the quotation, it sums up the visceral nature of the experience for this particular student, who was an international student living abroad, far from home, here by herself. And the quote goes, "As for today, it's Halloween and still nothing. No reason to leave the flat. No parties, no people, nothing. I really just feel like fuck COVID for screwing my Halloween, my favourite holiday, and fuck COVID for screwing my college experience, and fuck COVID for screwing my Scotland experience."
The isolation was huge. Like, they really, really struggled with being isolated, not being able to see their friends, not being able to meet with people. When you couldn't even kind of go out for a walk with people, that was really tough. I mean, for some of the students who were here, they obviously couldn't travel home to see family, couldn't do anything. So that was, quite difficult. So a lot of mental health problems throughout.
Well, I was part of the Uni Boobs Society in my undergrad, and there was definitely a push to kind of get some online stuff going on and just making sure we were checking in with each other. The Uni Boobs Society, I know we did quite a lot of like online quizzes, because we'd had a bunch of fundraisers planned for the last few weeks of uni, and obviously we weren't able to do them. But we really wanted to get fundraising done for Copperfield, so we sort of moved everything online. It definitely wasn't totally isolating. It definitely still felt engaged with uni, with like what we would have been doing on campus. It was just in a very different way.
We were looking at more or less 3 scenarios. I think we were looking at sort of £20 million hit, which was huge for an institution of our size. We had 3 scenarios, all of them were dire. All of them were really dire. And even as we were looking at scenario 1, which was the most benign, we didn't really grasp the fact that this is what was likely to come to pass. The third one was basically, can the last person switch the lights off?
Start of August was the first wave of emails saying such and such is leaving, their last day is. And then realising that protected conversations were happening, because my really great manager had one and took voluntary redundancy, saying, I think if I take voluntary redundancy, I'll save the rest of you. And we were gutted. 2 of us just immediately burst out crying. But anyway, she went, and so did quite a few folk. It felt like bloody loads of folk. It felt like you were getting nothing but emails being like, so-and-so's last day is blah, blah, blah.
So I can't remember when those letters went out about protected conversations. So whether we wanted to leave the university, basically. So a letter went out to all professors in our faculty asking, if we would like to have a protected conversation with the dean about our futures at Stirling, essentially. It was a really unsettling time. I can remember that, particularly the protected conversations, because I had no idea what that was, and a lot of us didn't. And so, we were emailing saying, have you got this letter too? What is a protected conversation?
Concerns about jobs was just some of the difficult subject matter that we touched on during our oral history interviews. And as a project team of staff and indeed students, we all really struggled with the early days of the pandemic and the lockdowns in particular. And we really thought when we embarked on these interviews that kind of echo chamber would be borne out in the sort of wider university community. So it was a really big surprise when actually that wasn't necessarily the case. We had colleagues in the staff community and the student community who had had much more positive experiences than we had had. It was really difficult to hear that sometimes.
The more interviews I conducted and worked on, the more I realised that although we had all lived through the same summer, our experiences were very different. Instead of telling me about their own gilded cage, Interviews spoke about enjoying the comforts at home. Instead of talking about pain and loneliness, they spoke about the weeks they had spent in calm meditation and recuperation. I started to doubt. What if lockdown had only hit me so hard, while everyone else had adapted and retained the sense of purpose I had so desperately struggled to retain? Suddenly, I felt ashamed about how much I struggled, and about how open I had been about that fact. But then I started working on the pandemic project, and the shame started to flare up once again. Had only I struggled so much with the lockdown experience? Was I too weak? Maybe everyone else had simply been better at focusing on the bright side of it all, leaving me to deal with the metaphorical battle scars of lockdown on my own. My forget-me-not from the pandemic. I finished some interviews feeling defeated and very much alone.
My experience of COVID was totally different to most people's because firstly I'm autistic and secondly I am a carer, and so I don't get to go anywhere or do anything, and all the clubs and societies went online, and so I was able to join them for the first time ever, and it just, the whole university experience for me felt inclusive for the first time, whereas I kind of always felt like an outsider, and then all of a sudden I was like involved in what everybody else was doing, so I actually made friends for the first time after being there for like 3 years, and so it was a really kind of inclusive experience for me, and plus I don't like making eye contact with people, so when I was walking down the street, I live in a tiny village, and all these people were like saying hello, and they'd literally cross the road to avoid me, and I was like, yes, this is amazing. I don't have to like speak to people anymore, I can literally just avoid you and everybody's doing it, so it's fine.
It was a positive time in my memory, and a happy time. It was very nice to be living at home with my parents again. And my brother Duncan, who lives in London, he also made it home just prior to lockdown. So there was me, Tamara, my mum and dad, and Duncan all living together. And the weather was fantastic that year. Probably the nicest weather I can ever remember living in Scotland. Pretty much, as far as it is in my memory, pure sunshine from March until June.
That was something that came up quite a lot in the interviews, that sort of friction between war and disease, and talking about them as one and the same in lots of ways, fights and struggles, and I think a lot of language that people use, particularly in terms of how to memorialise the pandemic, or discussing sort of how epoch-making it was, how sort of striking an event in our generation the pandemic was going to be. There were lots of comparisons to war.
I wonder whether we'll have a sort of pandemic memorial with the names of all those students and staff who died during the pandemic.
I reflected on other generations and what they had had to go through. My mother's generation had the Second World War, and my grandmother's generation endured the First World War. I just thought, well, this is 100 years later. This is equivalent of our war.
Very early on in the pandemic, I decided I would start sewing, and I made bunting. And my idea of the bunting was, and I nicknamed it Liberation Bunting. So I made this bunting, and my thought was that there would be a day where we'd be like, woohoo, we're open. And there'd be a physical thing, right? We're open, we're all back. Like we'd all troop back in and that would be that. And I realise it's not like that now. It's just that we get our liberation slowly, drop by drop. And then maybe it goes away for a bit and then it comes back. So I think, I just think maybe, I don't want to think it's part of life, but maybe it is part of life.
So we're here at the old Logate Kirkyard at the back of the Stirling University campus, which is a place that I came to on my last day on campus before the COVID lockdown in March 2020. I came here with two of my friends and colleagues, Matt and Tom. We took a photograph that day, and I've brought the photograph with me now. The photo itself is now part of the COVID collection at the university. The fact we took it shows you how much we realised at the time this was a big historical moment.
worth recording. Looking at the photograph now connects me with how that felt, with that historical memory, but it also connects me with the building here at the Kirkyard, and it makes you realise how much the building has seen since it was abandoned in 1805. And there's something reassuring about that, but also makes you realise how much more the building and ourselves may yet experience in the future.
Space and time doesn't get anywhere, and there was nothing else to do in this unusual period of unspecified length. I felt like I had nothing and no one. There was something very surreal, empty like a ghost town, dark and dreary. The future died again, awakening the dead.
The car parks were eerily empty as well. You know, there wasn't any sound for the sports fields. The campus was quite eerily quiet. You know, the occasional security officer, the occasional other essential member of staff wandering about, and some dog walkers, and everything else shut down. It was really quite weird. I'd never seen the place like that at all.
What I felt was all of a sudden as if time and space slowed down. And as the lockdown went into effect in the UK, you were almost going into slow motion, or you were all of a sudden in a film. You're almost like in a time and space that doesn't get anywhere. There's no movement.
I just really want to share my story because, well, I was on study abroad when COVID happened, so I was in North Carolina and obviously had to come home. And then I was doing my dissertation through the pandemic. So it was a real whirlwind for me, and I just wanted to be part of the story again. I feel like COVID has made us all isolate, and now we're all sort of segregated, and I really want to be part of things again. I want to be able to tell everyone what's happened over these 2 years, as I've not been able to. Just sort of scroll past it, forget about it. I had a lecture or something that day, so I just sort of got on with it. But then it was looking back, I'm like, maybe I should have paid more attention to what was happening, and try and understand what's happening around the world.